When the war ended, the surviving Jews were not received with embraces nor with justice. There was no home to return to, no family waiting for them, no country that wanted them. Among ruins, barbed wires that did not open completely, identity papers that did not match, and memories that burned, they began an uncertain path. This account follows their steps, from the displaced persons camps to the silent exiles, from the impossible reconstruction to the fragmented memory. Because surviving was not a happy ending, it was barely the beginning. Liberation without freedom. In the days and weeks when the camps were opened, liberation had nothing glorious about it. For many Jews, the long-awaited moment came late, in the midst of decay, hunger, plague, and death. What the Allied soldiers found were not human beings standing in celebration, but trembling skeletons wrapped in rags with vacant stares. Some did not even understand that they were being liberated. Others could no longer move, speak, or remember who they were. When the British troops entered Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, they found more than 10,000 unburied corpses and about 60,000 prisoners who were dying at a rate of hundreds per day. The images went around the world: mass graves, improvised stretchers, improvised crematoria with wood, doctors collapsing from exhaustion, survivors dying after being fed because their bodies could no longer process food. The British medical units tried to act quickly, but they were not prepared for what they saw: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, extreme malnutrition. In Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, or Theresienstadt, the scene was repeated, each one with its own hell. Some prisoners did not wait to be rescued. In the final days of the Third Reich, thousands were abandoned to their fate by the guards or freed by armed civilians. In other cases, the SS simply fled disguised, trying to go unnoticed among the liberated. In Gunskirchen, for example, the American soldiers liberated a camp in which the bodies were so piled up that walking without stepping on them was impossible. Several liberators cried, others vomited, no one left intact. For most Jews who survived the Holocaust, the end of the war did not mark a beginning, but an interlude. The destruction did not end in May of 1945. It merely changed form. In many cases, liberation was a slow, ambiguous experience, marked by uprooting, persistent hunger, disorientation, humiliation, and fear. According to Michael Brenner, in the weeks following the fall of the Third Reich, the survivors of the camp system were still under Allied custody, separated from the civilian population, without nationality, without papers, without homes to return to, without relatives to look for. Many of the concentration camps were temporarily converted into transit camps for liberated prisoners. In Bergen-Belsen, for example, where more than 35,000 people died between January and May of 1945, the British encountered an unprecedented sanitary catastrophe. The corpses were piled up in the open air, diseases spread uncontrollably, and the barracks were so infested with lice that they had to be burned. The British were forced to evacuate the survivors and build a new camp separated by barbed wire where the former prisoners would be fed, vaccinated, and slowly classified. The word they used was internees, for those who came from Auschwitz, Mauthausen, or Dachau, continuing to sleep on cots, continuing to see armed guards, continuing to hear shouted orders, did not resemble in any way the idea one might have of freedom. One of the most heartbreaking testimonies of this stage comes from Norbert Wollheim, survivor of Buna and witness to the chaos in the British occupation zone. Wollheim tells how the Jews liberated in northern Germany were completely alone, abandoned in destroyed towns, sleeping in stables, ignored by the German population who preferred not to see them. The Allied occupation did not immediately imply concern for the survivors. In many cases, American or British officers did not distinguish between former prisoners and displaced persons in general, and they even confined Jews and former SS members in the same accommodations as in Feldafing or initially in Buchenwald. The intervention of Rabbi Abraham Klausner and other Jewish envoys sent by international organizations was essential to demand differentiated and specific attention for the survivors of the genocide. From the summer of 1945 onwards, displaced persons camps, DP camps, began to be established under Allied administration, but with limited autonomy. They were organized according to the nationality or ethnicity of those interned. Poles on one side, Ukrainians on another, Jews in other sectors. In practice, many of these camps became small, autonomous Jewish communities with schools, synagogues, religious courts, libraries, publications, and Zionist organizations, but they remained camps with fences, regulations, and surveillance. Life there was not a celebration of survival, but a long and painful transit toward the unknown. The survivors had reasons to distrust the outside world. Those who tried to return to their hometowns, to Lublin, Lvov, Krakow, or Kielce, found closed doors, cold looks, murmured insults, and even bullets. In July of 1946 in Kielce, a mob murdered 42 Jews who had survived the war. The motive? A rumor about the ritual kidnapping of a child. The Nazis were no longer there, but structural antisemitism still breathed in the villages and in the streets. For many, the message was clear. You survived, but we do not want you here. The number of Jews liberated in Germany between 1945 and 1947 exceeded 250,000. The majority were not Germans, but Poles, Hungarians, Czechs and Romanians who had been deported to camps of the Reich. In areas such as Upper Bavaria, southern Hesse and northern Austria, improvised kibbutzim arose, led by Zionist movements such as Hashomer Hatzair or B'nai Akiva. They trained in agricultural work, children were educated in Hebrew, and they prepared for emigration to Palestine. In places like Landsberg, Fürstenwald or Feldafing, Jewish life briefly flourished among the ruins, but always with the awareness that this soil was not and would never be a home. In the camps, physical trauma competed with emotional trauma. Many survivors did not know if they were the only ones in their family who had lived. They looked for names on lists, hung on posts, in newspapers, on community boards. Often they encountered silence or emptiness. Others found people who claimed to be relatives or institutions that claimed to have located their children. In the case of children, especially the youngest, there was a struggle for identity and memory. Was that their name? Were those their parents? Were they Jewish, or had they been baptized by Catholic families to save them? Many times the children did not want to leave the convent, did not want to leave the family that had cared for them, and did not understand why someone demanded that they change their language, their clothing, their faith. In France, Belgium, and Hungary, this struggle reached the courts. The case of the child Robert Goldstein, whose custody was claimed by a Jewish organization against the will of his Catholic adoptive family, shows the complexity and emotional violence of those transitions. Meanwhile, the Allied bureaucracy had no answers. The United States maintained migration restrictions, and Palestine was under British mandate. Thousands of Jews remained trapped in Europe, without destination, without legal status, without citizenship. For the British, the Jews of the DP camps were a humanitarian problem, but also a political threat, especially when the clandestine immigration networks, the Brecha and later the Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, began to move thousands of people toward Italian or French ports in improvised ships that tried to evade the British naval blockade in Palestine. The history of those years is a history of waiting, of confinement, of hunger, and of blind reconstruction. Not all were able to leave. Not all survived the winter of 1946. Diseases continued to wreak havoc. Penicillin arrived late. Food was scarce. In many cases, international aid arrived slowly, and the camps depended on Jewish organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee or the ORT to sustain schools, clinics, kitchens, and workshops. But above all, what defines that stage is radical uncertainty. The Jews liberated in 1945 did not know if the world would receive them, if it would remember them, if it would listen to them. They did not know if they were survivors, if they were citizens, if they were Jews, if they were human. For years they walked through Europe carrying false names, unfinished pasts, broken bodies, and a story that no one wanted to hear. Their freedom was an act of slow, patient, and profoundly silent resistance. A freedom that did not come in the form of an Allied flag, but in that of an intimate decision to live when everything had said no. The post-war limbo and where they went after being liberated. For most Jews who survived the Holocaust, liberation did not mean the end of confinement, but the beginning of a new imprisonment under another name. Instead of returning to their homes, which in many cases no longer existed, they were sent to provisional facilities established by the Allied authorities. These places became known as displaced persons camps or DP camps. Between 1945 and 1951, more than 250,000 Jews passed through them, mainly in the American, British, and French occupation zones in Germany, Austria, and Italy. But these camps, although administered by the victors, had fences, watchtowers, rigid schedules, and censorship. And in many cases, the survivors found themselves living alongside former collaborators or even members of the SS. In the first months after the German surrender, the situation was desperate. The Allies did not differentiate between victims and perpetrators. The displaced were treated as a homogeneous mass, not as groups with distinct histories and needs. According to the Harrison Report by a United States presidential commissioner who visited the camps in 1945, the Jews were treated with the same indifference as ordinary Germans, housed in filthy barracks without adequate clothing or sufficient food. In some camps, the treatment was as inhumane as during the war. Harrison was horrified and sent an urgent memorandum to President Truman. Most of these Jews have no chance of returning to their homes in Eastern Europe. Many have been attacked or killed in the attempt. In response, a process of reorganization began. The Allies understood that the Jews needed separate spaces and specific attention. Thus were born exclusively Jewish camps such as Feldafing, Landsberg, Föhrenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. In these spaces, communities began to rise again from the mud and ruins. Schools, synagogues, periodical publications, theater companies, political parties, and Zionist youth movements were founded. In the Bergen-Belsen camp, Rabbi Leo Bayek conducted the first formal religious service after liberation, surrounded by survivors who still smelled of smoke and decomposition. Hebrew re-emerged as a language of education and resistance. Yiddish, too, became a vehicle for cultural reconstruction. The DP camps became a sort of organized exile, an ephemeral but vibrant homeland, where for the first time in years Jews could say their real names without fear. The Zionist organizations took advantage of that space to train the future pioneers of the Jewish state. In the camps, teenagers were trained, Hebrew songs were taught, plays about the Exodus were performed. The word they used for themselves was Sherit HaPletah, the remainder of the saved. They were not survivors, they were what was left of the people. But even there, life was precarious, material conditions were poor, food scarce, heating inadequate. In the winter of 1945, thousands died of diseases such as typhus, which had not yet been eradicated. Penicillin was rationed. The Joint Distribution Committee and other Jewish organizations such as ORT or HIAs helped sustain clinics, community kitchens, and schools, but trauma hovered in every corner. In the reports of social workers, one phrase was repeated: "The patient does not believe he is alive." Psychologists noted that many children did not know how to play, that adults ate anxiously and hid bread under their mattresses, as if the war were still going on. To this was added the anguish of waiting. The question was the same in all the camps, and now where to? For many, returning to their countries of origin was impossible or even deadly. In Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Hungary, anti-Semitic attacks continued. In cities such as Krakow or Lublin, survivors were beaten, expelled, or killed. The Kielce pogrom, where a mob murdered dozens of liberated Jews, confirmed the worst fears. Europe did not want them back. The United States, for its part, maintained a restrictive immigration policy with paltry quotas. Palestine was blocked by the British, who feared an Arab revolt if Jewish immigration increased. Thus, thousands of Jews remained trapped in camps where they lived in a limbo, neither prisoners nor free, neither citizens nor stateless, neither alive nor dead. In a British document from 1946, an official referred to the camps as ghost eaters. The word was not metaphorical. Many still bore tattoos on their arms, others did not even know their real surname, and several continued crying every night the name of their lost children. In spite of everything, life went on. Children were born in the camps, weddings were celebrated, poems were written. In the camp of Landsberg, the magazine Unser Wort published political articles, stories, satires and memoirs. In the DP camp of Föhrenwald, a young man named Yitzhak founded a Yiddish theatre group and adapted works by Sholem Aleichem. In Feldafing, a survivor from Vilna taught history classes to children who did not remember what a school was. Jewish identity was reconstructed upon the ruins of the previous world, with an obstinacy that had no logical explanation. It was simply impossible not to do so. But not everyone wanted to stay. The majority longed to leave, anywhere. In secret, thousands joined the clandestine emigration networks organized by the Brische, which guided groups from Poland to Italy or the French coast, across the Alps. From there they embarked on improvised ships bound for Palestine, defying the British naval blockade. The most well-known episode was that of the Exodus 1947, a ship with more than 4,500 Jews that was intercepted, and whose passengers were returned to Germany, where they were re-interned in British camps surrounded by barbed wire. The image was devastating. Jews locked up once again in Germany by British soldiers in the name of international diplomacy. In response to public outrage, the international community began to change its position. The United States pressured to facilitate migration. Truman signed in 1948 a special law to allow the entry of 80,000 displaced persons, many of them Jews. The creation of the State of Israel that same year finally opened a possible destination, but not without risks. Leaving for a country at war was not an easy decision, but for thousands it was preferable to continue waiting among the mud, the cans of military rations, and the compassionate looks of foreign soldiers. The DP camps emptied slowly. Some were deserted in 1949, others operated until 1951. By then, the majority of the surviving Jews had dispersed throughout North America, Israel, Australia, or Latin America. But the years in the camps marked their lives in an indelible way. In those spaces of transit, of mourning and reconstruction, a new world Jewish community was created, born not from synagogues nor from study, but from mud, from hunger, and from the need to imagine a possible future. They were camps where freedom did not yet exist, but the will to live had already been reactivated, and that was enough for the time being to resist one more day. Antisemitism after Auschwitz. When the Allies took Berlin, Nuremberg, Vienna and Munich, when the gates of Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Mauthausen were opened, many believed, or wanted to believe, that antisemitism had been defeated along with the Third Reich. It was a dangerous illusion. The industrial machine of extermination stopped, but the hatred was not dismantled, nor purged, nor exorcised. Anti-Jewish violence did not end with the ovens of Auschwitz. It transformed, shifted, changed form. In some parts of Europe, it revived with the same language of hatred as before, as if the 6 million murdered had not been enough to convince the world that anti-Semitism was a persistent threat. The most brutal, most symbolic, most scandalously forgotten case was the Kielce pogrom in Poland on the 4th of July of 1946. A 9-year-old Christian boy, Henryk Błaszczyk, disappeared for 2 days. When he returned, he said that he had been in the home of some Jews. No one investigated further. The police confirmed the rumor as true, and with that fuel, fury broke out. An armed crowd with sticks, stones and weapons went to number 7 on Planty Street, where a shelter for repatriated Jews operated. For several hours, the mob attacked those who lived there, beating them, shooting, throwing furniture and bodies out the windows. 42 people died, many at the hands of Polish police and soldiers who did not intervene or actively participated in the massacre. Kielce was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a series of attacks and harassment suffered by Jews who tried to return to their towns in Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Lithuania, and Romania. Returning was, many times, more dangerous than staying in the displaced persons camps. Those who arrived back in their cities found their houses occupied, their shops looted, their existence denied or abhorred. Some were killed just as they got off the train. Anti-Semitism no longer needed the Gestapo. The local community took care of reminding them that they were not welcome. In Poland, between 1945 and 1947, more than 1,000 documented episodes of violence against surviving Jews were recorded, including lynchings, beatings, robberies, and the burning of synagogues and cemeteries. Many Christian Poles feared that the Jews would reclaim properties that had been confiscated or inherited after deportation. The hatred was disguised as defense of property or as nationalism, but at its core it was the same racial resentment that had fueled pogroms for centuries. In Germany, meanwhile, the official pro-Allied discourse condemned anti-Semitism, but in the streets, survivors were still looked at as intruders. In a British intelligence report from 1946, it was documented that an alarming proportion of the German population believed that the Jews are taking advantage of the situation, that they exaggerate their suffering, and that it is time they stopped complaining. For some, the Jew was still the scapegoat par excellence, blamed for the war, for communism, for capitalism, for hunger, for the occupation. The narrative had not changed, it had only been modulated so as not to attract the attention of the American uniforms. To this was added indifference. In the city of Dresden, a German woman complained in a letter to the local editor that the Jews demand too much space in the newspapers when there are so many hungry Germans. In a report from the French occupation zone, anonymous pamphlets were recorded calling for the expulsion of the remaining Jews from the Rhineland. Even in the displaced persons camps, survivors suffered discrimination and harassment by German guards or locally hired civilian workers. In the Föhrenwald camp, a young Polish woman reported that a German nurse shouted at her, "If you died, it was for a reason, and if you live, it is out of pity." In Hungary, after the Soviet liberation, anti-Semitism mutated into an anti-bourgeois language, disguised as class struggle. Surviving Jews were accused of having become rich during the war, of collaborating with the communists, or of controlling the black markets. In reality, many lived in miserable conditions, without shoes, without family, without documents. But resentment was stronger than the truth. In the city of Miskolc in 1946, rumors circulated that the Jews used the blood of Christian children for rituals. There were attacks, stones thrown, and several dead. Often the survivors were accused of faking. In France, for example, several right-wing newspapers published articles denouncing false deportees and accused Jewish organizations of inflating the number of victims to obtain compensation. The same pattern was repeated in Belgium, Italy, Austria, and Romania. Suspicion, a mix of envy, guilt, and denial, contaminated the most basic social relationships. In a village near Lviv, a Ukrainian family asked the Soviet authorities not to allow the return of those annoying Jews who invent stories of ovens and poisonous showers. Horror was easily denied when one wanted to deny it. The Allied forces reacted late and cautiously. Although there were official condemnations, there was no systematic policy to eradicate social anti-Semitism. The denazification courts in Germany focused more on formal affiliations than on real attitudes. Many judges who in the 1930s had persecuted Jews returned to their positions. In Austria, the popular narrative was that the country had been a victim of Nazism and not its accomplice. Consequently, the crimes against the Jews were minimized or relativized. In Italy, the situation was similar. Fascism was repudiated, but the deported Jews were an uncomfortable nuisance, a guilt that no one wanted to carry. One of the most perverse effects of this persistence of anti-Semitism was the silence of many survivors. They feared not being believed. They knew that the world did not want to hear. In the displaced persons camps, in the reception houses, in the trains, many avoided telling what they had seen. Speaking was remembering, but it was also risking contempt. A girl interviewed by Rebecca Clifford in Survivors recalls that when she tried to say she had seen her mother die in front of her, the teacher responded, "That is a nightmare. Stop making things up." The trauma was, in many cases, double: what happened and what was not wanted to be heard afterward. Thus, the post-war world was not, for the Jews, a stage of reparation and empathy. It was a minefield of suspicions, humiliations, and new silences. Antisemitism had not died in Auschwitz, it had survived along with them. Only now it did not wear a uniform nor speak in German. Now it was in the murmurs, in the crooked looks, in the police who did not intervene, in the neighbor who closed the door. It was that anti-Semitism that pushed thousands to leave Europe, not because they could not live, but because they understood that they would no longer be allowed to do so as Jews. The dilemma of staying or emigrating far from still Nazi Germany. For the Jews who survived the Nazi hell, the most difficult question was not how to keep living, but where. The continent that had been their home for generations had turned into a cemetery. There were no houses, no neighbors, no recognizable streets. In many cases, there were no families left, no synagogues, no entire cemeteries. Europe was in ruins, yes, but Jewish life was even more destroyed, turned into smoke, into bones, into handwritten records from concentration camps. Faced with this panorama, the decision about the immediate future became an existential dilemma: to stay or to leave. It was not a free choice. It was a decision shaped by fear, by loss, by persistent anti-Semitism, by political pressure, and by material limitations. Many survivors did not know if they could return to their places of origin, and if they did, whether they would be accepted or killed. Others did not know where to go, nor how to begin. Some, out of exhaustion or because they did not have the strength to cross another country with nothing but what they wore, decided to stay at least for a time in the same displaced persons camps where they had been housed by the Allies. Others, from the first day of freedom, sought a way to leave Europe forever, even if it meant embarking on clandestine journeys, crossing illegal borders or waiting years for a visa. Michael Brenner, in After the Holocaust, shows in detail how this decision divided the Jews in Germany between those who believed in the reconstruction of Jewish life upon the ruins of the Reich and those who saw in the diaspora, or in the new state of Israel, the only possible way out. In cities such as Berlin or Munich, some community leaders began to organize cemeteries, schools, synagogues, newspapers, even marriages. They attempted to restore a cultural and religious life that would give meaning to survival, especially among German Jews who had returned from exile or from Soviet captivity. But it was not simple. Rubble was everywhere, and so was anti-Semitism. In rural areas of Bavaria, the mere fact that a Jew walked down the street generated rejection. In other cases, there were simply no other Jews left with whom to rebuild anything. On the other hand, the Jews of Eastern Europe did not want to live again under the same roofs where they had been betrayed. In Poland, for example, those who returned often found their houses occupied by neighbors who refused to return the properties. Sometimes they were expelled with violence, and other times they were killed. It did not matter that they had papers or that they had been deported from there. They were seen as intruders, as threats, as vengeful ghosts. Thus, many who had originally thought of going back home quickly changed their minds upon discovering that they no longer had a home or a country. In the words of a survivor quoted by Brenner, "Where I was a child, now I am a foreigner. Where I was a victim, now I am a suspect." In the midst of this confusion, emigration became an obsession, a necessity, a hope, but it was not easy. The United States maintained a system of restrictive and complex immigration quotas. Great Britain, which administered Palestine under the League of Nations mandate, severely restricted the entry of Jews for fear of tensions with the Arab population. Only 1,500 Jews per month were allowed to enter legally. The rest, tens of thousands, were considered illegal immigrants and were intercepted at sea. Many were returned to Europe, even to Germany. The most symbolic case was that of the Exodus 1947, a ship with more than 4,500 refugees, which was rejected by the British and whose passengers ended up being forcibly relocated to detention camps in Hamburg. For the survivors who disembarked from that ship, the humiliation was absolute. After having escaped the Nazi camps, they were imprisoned again in Germany, guarded by armed soldiers. Faced with the impossibility of emigrating legally, clandestine networks emerged that tried to get the survivors off the continent. One of the most active was the Brischa, a secret organization that helped Jews escape from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania to Italian or French ports. Thousands crossed borders at night with children in their arms, crossing the Alps on foot, hidden in trucks or in coal train wagons. From Genoa or Marseille, they tried to board small, fragile ships that would take them to Palestine. The conditions were extremely harsh: hunger, cold, surveillance, detentions, but many preferred that risk to continuing to survive among the ashes of Europe. At the same time, Jewish organizations in Latin America, Canada, Australia, and South Africa began to mobilize to receive refugees. Argentina, for example, was one of the few countries to accept a significant number of surviving Jews, especially between 1946 and 1948. But even in the countries that offered asylum, integration was neither immediate nor easy. The language, the poverty, the pain, the feeling of having arrived late to life, everything conspired against peace of mind. Even so, many clung to that unknown land as the only possibility of starting anew without looking back. In the political sphere, the creation of the State of Israel in May of 1948 functioned as a definitive catalyst. For thousands of Jews in the displaced persons camps, the birth of the new state was a concrete, tangible sign that the Jewish people could still have land, an army, a language, and dignity. A massive exodus toward Israel was organized, now with institutional backing. In the camps, where Hebrew had previously been taught clandestinely, maps of the new state were now printed, the Hatikvah was sung, enlistment forms were distributed. Many of those who emigrated in those years quickly integrated into the new country, even participating as soldiers in the War of Independence. Others became part of the civil fabric of the young state: teachers, doctors, farmers, parents. However, not everyone wanted to leave. Some, above all the elderly, the weakened, those who no longer had strength, chose to stay. In West Germany, small Jewish communities began to be rebuilt in cities such as Frankfurt, Berlin, or Düsseldorf. Many of those who stayed were employed by the Allied forces as interpreters, doctors, teachers, or technicians. There were also those who wanted to bear witness, write, denounce, and considered that their place was there where everything had happened. The creation of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland, Central Council of Jews in Germany, in 1950 was a sign that in spite of everything, some Jews still considered that Germany could once again be a place of Jewish life. Although the memory of the past was omnipresent for some, survival also meant regaining the right to live wherever they wished, even there where they had once been meant to be erased. The fate of the Jewish children. At first, they were small numbers pinned to the coat of a boy who did not know how to read his surname. In a white room, a nurse took his temperature, a doctor opened his mouth with a tongue depressor. Someone noted that he had lice, scabies, persistent cough. On the medical card, they wrote "language undefined." The child did not respond in Polish, nor in Hungarian, nor in German. He had learned shouted orders and scattered words to survive. No one knew his real name. In many post-war children's homes, the first act of reconstruction consisted of naming again, searching for a record, a photo, a letter, something that would return to that child's body, a history. In the corridors of the foster homes, a borrowed castle on the outskirts of Paris, a stone mansion in the English countryside, a confiscated school in Bavaria, the adults drew up inventories of childhood: height, weight, marks on the skin, scars, languages, prayers they remembered, surnames that perhaps were not theirs. There were children who called themselves by the name a nun had whispered to them to avoid a patrol. Others kept the Yiddish pronunciation of a grandmother they could no longer remember. The name was a key. If it opened, relatives came. If not, the past remained empty. Many would grow with that gap, whole persons with a beginning amputated. Play, that natural grammar of childhood, came late or deformed. In the yards, some children did not know what to do with a ball. Others responded to a whistle as if it were the factory siren and lined up by reflex. Teachers recorded behaviors we would now call trauma: hypervigilance, startle at any noise, hoarding of food, bread hidden under the mattress, a potato kept in the pocket because tomorrow could always be a day without soup. Bedwetting at night in boys already old enough to feel shame, selective mutism in girls who spoke alone but not in front of strangers, nightmares that left them exhausted and condemned them to sleep on tiptoe in case they had to run. They were taught to play as one teaches a language. A teacher drew a house and asked them to copy it. Sometimes there appeared walls without doors, windows with bars, chimneys that emitted black smoke. A boy painted a tree with fruit and hung a sign that said "No entry." He said it was his forest, the only one where no one found them. Another filled a paper with invented names and recited them as if they were a prayer. a desperate attempt to fix identities that escaped him. In an English home, a psychologist observed that the youngest calmed down with inventories, not with stories. They listed how many spoons were on the table, how many chairs, how many steps from the bed to the door. The certainty of the count returned a bit of control. It was not uncommon for the children to arrive baptized or with foreign religious habits, the result of convents and families who had hidden them. The dilemma was harsh: to strip them of that belonging at once, to return them to an identity that in some cases they did not remember. There were custody trials that lasted for years. Catholic families who had saved a life claimed the continuity of the bond. Jewish organizations demanded the return to the community of origin, even when that community was an abstraction made of absentees. While the adults litigated, the child looked at two worlds that asked for opposite loyalties. They were asked to choose at 10 years old what sometimes they could not even name. The search for relatives was a collective right. In the displaced persons camps, bulletin boards were hung with typewritten lists of surnames, dates, and towns. Those who passed by with blurred vision put their finger where they thought they recognized something and asked about a person they did not know how to hold in memory. The tracing organizations, Red Cross, restitution offices, improvised archives, received envelopes with torn photos, letters, pendants, medals, medallions. Sometimes an uncle arrived, sometimes someone who said he was, and sometimes the one who arrived was a new past with another name, another language, and another religion. Many accepted a biography out of trust because the adult who brought it cried and brought bread. Years later, that white lie would become a crack. In the children's homes, the rules were a refuge. Meals were at fixed hours, hands were washed, beds were made with military hospitality, lines were formed to enter the dining room. Some directors forbade speaking of the past. They believed that closing that door was the only way to build a useful future. Others promoted talking circles, drawings, small ceremonies to say farewell to the absent. No formula was perfect. Silence was made of modesty and fear, but also of emotional economy. The adults who had seen too much did not always have the strength to sustain the children's stories. There were caregivers who acted as mothers without ever using the word. There were directors who were survivors and who taught how to conjugate the verb to live with a fierce patience. School was the first laboratory of integration. Teaching to read to someone who spoke 3 languages poorly was not a matter of grammar, but of belonging. In some homes, Hebrew was chosen as the language of the future. In others, the language of the host country. In many, Yiddish continued to be the mother tongue of those who no longer had a mother. Literacy came with an unexpected gift, the possibility of writing one's own name on a sheet of paper and later on a document. Many children kept their first signatures as relics. It was the material proof that they existed without the permission of the past. Adolescence arrived like a second assault. Bodies grew, and with them certain memories that had lain dormant. For some, the first infatuation stumbled upon survivors' guilt. With what right to feel happy? Others channeled the energy into trades, carpentry courses, printing, electricity, sewing. Manual, repetitive work healed through rhythm, weaving restored weave, wood obeyed and returned a shape. Where there had been dread, making was a way of thinking. In the host countries, the adults projected expectations. In Israel, the boy who became strong, sunburned, who learned to plant and to carry a rifle was valued. In the United States or in Argentina, the one who integrated, quickly learned the language and became useful and discreet was celebrated. That gaze shaped biographies. Many learned to act resilient so as not to be sent back to the social worker's office. Being the lucky ones was a label that obliged silence. If you were alive, you had to be grateful. If you spoke of nightmares, you were out of tune. Nevertheless, there were adults who listened. Psychologists and educators took notes without judging, observed the games, identified patterns, imagined treatments when the word trauma was still not common currency. Some caregivers prohibited shouting and whistles, understood that sound could be a trap. Rituals of predictability were established, announcing a change in advance, describing the steps of an excursion, guaranteeing that the hallway light would remain on. It was discovered that putting into words what was going to happen lowered the children's pulse, as if the future could be tamed with a simple script. Family reunifications were often collisions of tectonic plates. A father returning from a Soviet camp encountered a son who already had another voice, another bed, another mom who was not his dead wife. An aunt who had survived in hiding wanted to impose a tradition that the child did not recognize as their own. There were hugs that lasted a minute and then became rough routine. Dishes that did not taste the same, stories that did not match, silences that unintentionally offended. Some children chose to remain with the foster families, others departed to new countries with an almost unknown adult and learned that loyalty can be a fragile bridge. As the years went by, many of those children became storytellers. They learned to speak without collapsing, measured the dose of memory so as not to drown the listener nor themselves. Some legally adopted the name they had been given to save them. Others recovered an old one and carried it like a medal and a question. In newly begun albums, they pasted the first photographs taken afterward. Those from before almost never existed. When they were asked for documents, their life began on the date of registration at a children's home. The bureaucratic world accepted that fiction because it was practical. They accepted it because it gave them a date of birth. In that post-war childhood, there were also joys without explanation. An excursion to the lake in summer, the discovery that bread could be eaten without hiding it, the wonder of a cinema for the first time. A song learned in chorus that closed the throat with emotion without knowing why. And there were absolute friendships, blood pacts, between children who did not want to lose each other again. In many houses, a teacher pinned a world map to the wall and asked them to mark with a pin where they wanted to go. Some stuck the pin in a place they did not know how to pronounce, others in the country where they were, others did not stick it anywhere. They remained looking at the ocean as if it were a blank blackboard. The survivors who created Israel. When the trains stopped running to the camps and the gas chambers fell silent, hundreds of thousands of Jews wandered through a Europe that no longer had a place for them. They were not citizens, nor did they have homes to return to. For many of them, the only place that offered a horizon was a piece of land they did not know, but which in whispers and songs had been imagined for generations: Palestine. That territory, under British administration since the end of the Ottoman Empire, was seen not only as a refuge but as a long-postponed promise. In the years immediately after the war, that promise took concrete form. The news from the extermination camps, the images of the living skeletons liberated by the Allies, the stories of orphaned children, of survivors without a country or family, struck deep in the conscience of many Jewish communities. The idea of rebuilding life in the places where it had been destroyed seemed unthinkable to some and profoundly undesirable to others. What sense was there in returning to the house from which they had been expelled with blows, when the neighbors had remained silent or collaborated? What could a continent offer that had not prevented their extermination? Migration to Palestine then became a cause, a campaign, and an epic. It was not easy. The British government, pressured by conflicts with the local Arab population, severely limited Jewish immigration. Dozens of clandestine ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying survivors hidden below deck, sick, hungry, exhausted. Some were intercepted by British patrols and their passengers interned in Cyprus or sent back to Europe. In other cases, the ships sank or were attacked, like the famous Exodus 1947, whose fate mobilized international public opinion. Despite the restrictions, the massive arrival of Jews to the British Mandate became an irreversible political fact. For the newcomers, Palestine was not an idyllic promised land, but a difficult frontier, with languages they did not understand, a hostile climate, tensions with the Arab inhabitants, and unfamiliar social structures. Many came from displaced persons camps, from collective homes, or from years of hiding in forests and cellars. They were broken people with silent stories who landed in a society that valued strength, physical labor, and self-sufficiency. There was a deep gap between the heroic narrative of the pioneer who builds a nation from nothing and the silent survivor who carried invisible scars. Even so, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was received by much of the Jewish world as a rebirth, not only political, but symbolic. For the first time in centuries, Jews would have their own army, their own government, a flag that represented them. It was an act of restitution in the face of history. In that new state, every survivor had a place. But there were also implicit conditions. The past had to be useful, had to merge with the national narrative, had to be read as a lesson in resistance and not as an open wound. Many who had been children in the ghettos or the camps suddenly found themselves in uniform, learning to handle weapons, swearing loyalty to a country that was just being born. Some participated in the War of Independence, others worked in kibbutzim or were placed in schools and boarding houses where they were encouraged to forget Yiddish, the customs of Eastern Europe, the pain. The new Hebrew was a language of the future, of construction, not of mourning. Life in Israel was not a magical solution to suffering. Integration was uneven. There were prejudices toward the newcomers, especially those who did not adapt quickly to the dominant Zionist model. Trauma was not discussed. For years, speaking about the Holocaust was frowned upon, even associated with shame or weakness. Only in the 1960s, with the Eichmann trial and the emergence of the first survivors' associations, did that perception begin to change. Despite everything, the very existence of Israel altered the emotional map of the Jewish people. It gave a center to a dispersed diaspora, offered a tangible alternative to exposure. For many who had lost everyone, who did not know where their parents or siblings were buried, planting a tree on a deserted hill, building a house in a new village, constructing a school with names that no one remembered anymore, was a form of active mourning. It was not about returning to the past, but about creating a place where that past could not be repeated. The hidden children, surviving under another name. Not all Jewish children survived the Holocaust in camps or ghettos. Thousands did so hidden behind an identity that was not their own. During the years of persecution, when the German machinery of extermination spread across all of Europe, many families chose the only possibility that left some hope, separating the children, leaving them with strangers, inventing them a surname, a religion, a story. In some cases, it was a planned decision. In others, a desperate act in the middle of a raid. They were handed over to peasants, to nuns, to childless couples, to former employees, to trusted neighbors. Sometimes they were hidden in cellars, in barns, in rural schools, or they were sent with groups of orphans, hoping they would get lost among them. They were 2 or 3 years old. Some barely knew how to speak. For years they lived as others. They responded to new names. They learned to recite Catholic prayers. They were baptized. They called Mama another woman. They forgot that they had once had a brother, a house, a cradle in another language. Some were very well treated. They received affection, food, shelter. Others suffered neglect, beatings, rapes. But all had in common a wound, the lie, the rupture, the uprooting. They were children who could not ask questions, who had to be careful not to talk in their sleep, who did not understand why they were alive when so many others were not. When the war ended, the situation was not resolved. In many cases, no one came looking for them. Their parents had been murdered. There were no relatives left. And even when an uncle appeared, a cousin, a gaunt mother who had survived Auschwitz or Siberia, the children did not always want to leave. Some resisted, screamed, ran away. They did not understand who that sad adult was who hugged them crying. For them, their life was another, their surname was another, their God was another. What came before was covered by a thick veil of forgetfulness and confusion. There were legal battles. In France, in Belgium, in Italy, courts decided over the identity of the children. Some foster families refused to hand them over. They argued that they had saved their life, that they had raised them, that they were no longer Jewish. In many cases, they were right. The children knew nothing of their origin. They did not understand the rituals, did not speak the language of their grandparents. In British Mandate Palestine, Jewish organizations fought to bring these children to what would become the future state of Israel. They said they were part of the people who had suffered, that they had to be rebuilt as Jews. On the other side, Catholic institutions clung to their custody. Some had been baptized, and according to canon law, that made them part of the church. The fight was not only legal, it was symbolic. To whom did a child without parents, without a name, without memory belong? Was he a survivor or a hostage? Did he have the right to ignore his past? Should he be returned to an identity he did not remember? Or could he choose the one he had learned during the war? There were no simple answers. Each case was unique, but all shared the same tension, the conflict between the love received and the truth denied, between the adopted identity and the one that had been torn away. In the following years, many of these children rebuilt their stories piece by piece. Some did so as adults, searching archives, letters, lists, witnesses. Others never succeeded. They carried a suspicion, an intuition, a void. There were those who discovered the truth by accident, by a conversation overheard in secret, by a forgotten document, by a photograph hidden in a box. For many, knowing who they were was a painful process that did not bring immediate comfort. Some rejected their origin. Others embraced it with fervor, as a mission. Some never managed to integrate it fully. Most lived with a broken identity. When speaking about their childhood, they did not know where to start. They had two births, two genealogies, two memories, often contradictory. They were not only children of the Shoah, they were survivors in a more solitary and ambiguous way. They did not see the gas chambers, but they lived entire years hiding who they were. And when they could say it, they were no longer sure they were. In the following decades, these children became adults with a particular sensitivity. Many devoted themselves to memory, to psychology, to history. Some isolated themselves. Others built families obsessed with the truth. Almost all felt that they had lost something essential, even if they did not always know how to name it. The victims who were forgotten. Just a few months after the liberation of the camps, when the physical wounds had not yet healed, nor had they managed to understand what they had lived through, they encountered a society busy rebuilding cities, economies, alliances, and borders. The urgency of the present left no room for the voices of the past. In many countries, the survivors' accounts were uncomfortable, unbearable, or outright denied. No one wanted to hear about the trains, the hunger, the selections, the ovens. The first form of repression was silence. In France, Belgium, Hungary, the Netherlands, or Poland, the official narrative tended to subsume Jewish suffering within the general suffering of the war. We were all victims, it was said. But the Jewish experience had been different. They had not died in bombings nor on battlefields, but in gas chambers, in ditches they themselves had dug, in camps where the crime was systematic and bureaucratic. Silence was, in those contexts, a way of erasing that difference. On an individual level, many survivors also chose to remain silent, not by will, but by necessity. The pain was so deep, so unutterable, that words became treacherous, and when they tried to speak, the reaction of the other was often evasive, mocking, or distrustful. There were those who did not believe something so monstrous could have been possible. Others said, there must have been a reason. There was no shortage of those who attributed survival to supposed collaboration with the Nazis. Thus, speaking about the past became a double sentence, reliving the horror and being judged for having lived it. Stigma surrounded many of those who left the camps. In Eastern Europe, where the new communist regimes promoted a collective vision of wartime suffering, Jews who spoke about the extermination were accused of particularism, of wanting to differentiate themselves. In some cases, they were even persecuted or censored for insisting on telling their story. In the Western countries, by contrast, the gaze was more insidious. Survivors were perceived as marked bodies, as uncomfortable symbols, as reminders of what had been allowed. This marginalization was not only symbolic. In many communities, survivors found no support networks. They were not received with compassion, but with distance. They were seen as broken, difficult, traumatized people. At times, they were kept away from jobs, from possible marriages, from community positions. Women especially suffered a double invisibility for having been victims and for being women in patriarchal contexts where speaking of rape, humiliation, or sterility was taboo. The children who had survived under false identities encountered a different rejection. Some were returned to distant relatives who did not recognize them, or to communities that questioned their origin. Their childhood, marked by displacement, loss, and fear, found no place in a society that idealized innocence and post-war joy. They were expected to be normal, to study, to grow, to be grateful. But many continued sleeping with a knife under the pillow or hoarding breadcrumbs as in the camps. This general climate of silence and stigmatization had profound consequences. For 2 decades, testimonies were sporadic, marginal. Memoirs were published, such as Primo Levi's, but with little impact. Survivors were not seen as sources of knowledge, but as uncomfortable witnesses. Their stories were too dark, too brutal. Schools did not teach what had happened. The media did not speak about the crematoria or the camps. Only from the 1960s, and with even greater force in the 70s and 80s, did this trend begin to change. The trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem was a turning point. For the first time, survivors' testimonies were heard on an international broadcast. The victims began to occupy the center of the narrative. They were no longer shadows walking among the living, but voices that challenged history. Nevertheless, this recognition came late and did not reach everyone. Many died before being heard. Others could never break the wall of inner silence. Over the years, some began to speak within the family, others before school groups, some before a camera. Each testimony was an intimate repair, but also a way of confronting the trauma, the incomplete memory, the pain that did not cease. And even so, every time someone recounted what they had lived, they felt again, even if only for a moment, not judged, not forgotten, not alone. The forgotten of reparations, the victims without compensation. In the years that followed the end of the war, the world witnessed an unprecedented phenomenon. Millions of victims demanded justice, memory, and reparations. But in the case of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, not all received what they expected. Although bilateral agreements were signed, compensation committees were created, and organizations such as the Claims Conference managed thousands of payments. A significant portion of survivors was left out because of the fine print, the deadlines, the legal categories imposed from distant offices, the lack of evidence, omission, arbitrariness, or simply not being in the right place at the right time. The first major agreement was signed in 1952 between the Federal Republic of Germany and Israel, along with the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany. This historic pact recognized, in general terms, Germany's moral and financial obligation to compensate Jews persecuted by the Nazi regime. Israel would receive a lump sum to help absorb and settle the survivors arriving from Europe. In addition, individuals could apply for personal compensation for persecution, forced labor, loss of property, or imprisonment. But that apparent generosity concealed exclusionary criteria. To be compensated, the survivor had to prove having been persecuted for racial or religious reasons. Those who could not clearly document their status or who had been in territories under Soviet occupation were excluded. And even more seriously, many victims who had survived in hiding for years without having passed through concentration camps did not qualify as persecuted under German bureaucratic criteria. Those who had saved their lives by fleeing, changing identity, hiding in cellars or convents were considered not eligible, as if only deportation validated suffering. Others were excluded for geographical or political reasons. Survivors living in Eastern Europe, especially in the Soviet Union, Romania, or Hungary, could not apply for compensation until decades later, and in many cases never did. There were no German consulates, no available information, no safe channels. For those living under communist regimes, speaking about German compensation was also politically risky. As a result, tens of thousands of people who had lost their families, homes, and communities died without having received a single cent. In Latin America, there were also forgotten ones. Many Jews who emigrated to Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, or Mexico did so with false papers, reconstructed identities, or without any documentation proving their time in camps or ghettos. Others never knew they had the right to start a claim or found out when it was already too late. Some were illiterate, elderly, without networks or information. The process was long, in German or Hebrew, requiring documents, witnesses, stamps, old passports, arrest certificates, receipts for expropriated properties. Who could prove anything after fleeing through forests or after losing everything in a train station? Also excluded for legal reasons were those who had suffered persecution under regimes allied with the Third Reich, such as in Hungary or Romania before 1944. Germany argued that it was not responsible for crimes committed by other states, even if the perpetrators acted in coordination with the Nazis. The result was that thousands of victims of Hungarian ghettos, forced labor camps in Transylvania, or detainees of the Romanian gendarmerie, were left without recognition or compensation. Added to this were differences in the real value of the pensions received. A survivor in Germany could receive a monthly compensation of up to 300 German marks, with health coverage included. One in Israel, by contrast, had to settle for smaller amounts without the same benefits, and one in Argentina or Canada could only access occasional payments managed by NGOs without any access to state support. This inequality generated resentment among the survivors themselves, who began to divide between the compensated and the not compensated. But beyond the figures, what hurt was the criteria. To receive a pension for psychological damages, for example, a specific level of medical impairment had to be proven. How is the trauma of having seen your parents die measured? How is the chronic anguish of living without knowing what happened to your siblings proven? How can the fear of a childhood spent underground or the silence of a woman raped in a labor camp be quantified? The logic of the forms could not capture the ineffable. Over the years, some doors opened. Germany extended deadlines, loosened criteria, enabled new programs. Some excluded categories were finally recognized, such as survivors of certain ghettos not officially considered closed, or those who had been in forced labor camps outside the concentration camp system. Programs were also created for those who had been in hiding or had lived in inhuman conditions in occupied territories, but by then many had already died. The institutions that managed the reparations were also subject to criticism. The Claims Conference in particular was denounced for its lack of transparency, its excessive bureaucracy, and for a case of internal corruption that broke out in 2010. Although it was responsible for distributing billions of dollars in compensation, it was accused by survivors of acting coldly, of imposing insensitive administrative criteria, and of not having done enough for the poorest or those living on the periphery. The word reparation suggests that something can be fixed. But for many, that promise never came. Neither the money, nor the recognition, nor even the name on a list, only oblivion, or worse still, suspicion. Because in some contexts, receiving compensation was seen as taking advantage of the tragedy, and many survivors hid the fact that they received a pension for fear of being stigmatized or misunderstood. Others never wanted to ask for anything, out of dignity or distrust. They did not want alms, they said, only justice. But justice, as always, came late, or never came. 70 years after the end of the war, there are still closed archives, unresolved files, pending claims. There are still widows without compensation, children without recognition, victims without a voice. The reparation system was a step forward, but it was also a filter, a boundary between those who managed to be part of the official narrative of suffering and those who remained on the other side. What did not return? Returning was not always possible, and when it was, it did not mean going back. There was no possible reconstruction for many of the things that were lost. The shtetls where no one spoke Yiddish anymore, the synagogues reduced to warehouses or ruins, the cemeteries erased with shovels. Tens of thousands of Jews returned to their towns, if they were still standing, and walked through familiar streets that no longer belonged to them. There were familiar faces, yes, but with closed doors, with voices that did not ask, did not greet, did not recognize. In many cases, they were the same people who had denounced or looted them during the occupation. Jewish life in Eastern Europe had been wiped out, not only by death, but by the transformation of the landscape. In Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, or Hungary, the war had reformatted cities, social networks, properties, structures. Reopening a business, teaching Hebrew, restarting the liturgical calendar was an act of defiance. Some tried, a few succeeded, but the numbers were minimal. In cities such as Łódź, Krakow, Vilnius, or Bratislava, Jewish life was a distant echo. For many survivors, even outside Europe, there was no desire to remember. The past was a minefield they preferred not to tread. In the early years, testimonies found no listeners. Societies around the world, including Jewish ones in the diaspora, looked forward. People spoke of reconstruction, of progress, of family, not of Auschwitz, not of Treblinka, not of the ashes of the children. The women who had survived with broken lives kept silent. The men tried to become providers again, fathers, merchants. The children born after the war were raised in homes where photographs were missing, stories were avoided, and gestures were more eloquent than words. In many of those homes, pain was a language without translation. Israel was no exception. Although survivors were fundamental in building the new state, in the early years they were viewed with ambivalence. Some considered them the embodiment of the weakness of the European Jew in the face of Nazism. They were called sabonim, soap, in a cruel play on the fate symbolized by the crematoria. Only decades later, after the Eichmann trial, did survivors' testimonies begin to occupy a central place in Israel's national narrative. But for many, the process was long, lonely, and silent. Trauma seeped into daily life: insomnia, fear of confinement, broken relationships, panic attacks. Some slept with knives under their pillows, others kept food in their pockets. Some spoke in their sleep in languages their children did not understand. Mental illness, suicide, and the inability to form emotional bonds marked the lives of tens of thousands. Even those who managed to rebuild their lives, in Canada, in France, in Argentina, in Australia, carried with them a permanent sense of unreality. It was common for them to say they were dead in life, that what came afterward was borrowed, stolen time. In many cases, they never told what they had lived through. Some waited decades to speak. Others wrote it in secret. Others denied it always. In every family, there was an empty chair, a burned letter, a nameless grave, a voice that did not have time to say goodbye. In Jewish communities around the world, commemorations multiplied, but mourning was incomplete. There were no bodies to bury. There were no last words. There was no justice for the majority. For the orphans, the lack of origin was a fracture without repair. Children who did not know their real surname, who did not know if they were Polish, Ukrainian, Hungarian, or simply Jewish. Some were raised by Christian families, others by Jewish institutions. Some jumped from country to country, carrying Red Cross folders and provisional identity certificates. One day they were David, another day they were Stefan, or Moshe, or Franz. Some lived entire years in DP camps, believing that was their homeland. Others never again spoke the language of their parents. There were also silences imposed by time. The oldest survivors died without telling. Others did so when no one asked anymore. For years, the Holocaust archive was made of scraps, diaries, letters, rescued photos, incomplete testimonies. The great figures, the 6 million, the camps, the dates, hid thousands of personal stories that were never told. Not because they did not matter, but because no one listened.